Subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to get all the latest updates.
Just in the months of September and October, the city of Bengaluru has seen more than 5 buildings collapse. This collapsing of buildings has become an annual recurring phenomenon in the city. This year, BBMP or Brihat Bengaluru Mahanagara Palike officials stated that the incessant heavy rains being witnessed by the city is one of the major reasons for the collapse. But is that the entire story? Let's find out from some experts.
I think the tremendous spurt of growth, makes for a lot of cities in the world look like giant construction sites all the time. It's in a state of dynamic flux, and and that is the reality of it. The Bangalore that I grew up in was a sleepy, town-like city where everybody knew everybody else. But yes, change is inevitable. So I think there are a couple of prongs to this whole issue. And I think in any robust and resilient sort of local governance system, where there are, and of course, it's always in a state where one is growing to, grow that whole aspect of democracy and governance, right? Local governance and systems put in place. So while it's growing and being tested at all times, fundamentally, it has the role to establish certain systems by which the citizenry is able to operate with a certain amount of ease, in terms of the way that sites come up next to each other, they respect each other. There's got to be rules and regulations which govern those adjacencies. So the first prong of this is that local government systems need to be ensured of their robustness. The second prong is to do with the architect and the structural engineer. In most cases, there are no architects. These are self-employed, self-styled architects, perhaps if there was one, or someone just sort of, does his thing from common sense or some experience. So that's the second prong, which in this case becomes problematic. And the third is again linked to citizenry and government interaction mechanisms, that there is no recourse to really report something which looks like a dangerous condition, whether it's a fire safety hazard or that no bylaws are being followed to the detriment of a neighbor. Whatever they might be, there is really no public recourse to action taken from those who could act. So I think these are the three prongs that work together in situations where you have these sort of unfortunate collapses. So in a situation like this, one would assume, especially where the building sort of sank to one side, you assume that therefore it could have been filled soil, it could have been a former garbage dump, it could be very, very many factors. So I think the role of the structural engineer, and that is, very often buildings are constructed with just someone who has a civil engineering background, right? Without the specific expertise of a structural engineer. And small buildings, yes, it's okay. But when you talk about multi-story buildings, there is a specialist domain of knowledge that needs to be tapped into. Mm-hmm. And so I think, yes, these would be the three prongs, mm-hmm. and the conditions under which things fail. I mean, one hopes in a case like this that it's an off, it's off the typical sort of example. One hopes that, okay, something collapsed somewhere else, there was an impact. And yes, those opportunities, those unfortunate opportunities can happen where there's something downstream or upstream, and it leads to a sudden, a soil malfunction, the whole thing collapses. These are rare though. And still yet, I would say, can happen. But I think the other part of it, which really no one wants to talk about, is the fact that there's so much of, what is the word? Could I call it a non reporting, a non, what is the word? A non-functioning really of the whole regulatory mechanism by which buildings must be built and bylaws honored, and fire regulations taken care of. So for instance, if we were talking about the structural engineer, right? So if the soil is weak, so obviously in a good building, you need to, in a good or efficient work, you need to first test the soil. And there are organizations that do that. The structural engineer needs to be competent to be able to gauge whether if the soil is below a certain capacity, that you would either, whether do you do a pile foundation, do you do a raft foundation, what is the appropriate measure to take, right? In terms of a footing and a foundation system. In the absence of that, then people are making very general assumptions, and that's very dangerous. And I think that might really be what has happened.
Right.
And you talked about the NOC, or the occupation, I'm sorry, the occupancy certificate not coming in. Very often buildings are built which don't follow the bylaws. That's very common. And I think the government machinery is probably too large and bumbling to be able to nip it in the bud, to be able to follow up, to be able to see that sanction drawings are not matching, and that basically one needs to have the teeth to drive such regulations into place. And it's unfortunate because it really impacts so much. It impacts the whole fabric of the city, it has negative adverse impact in many, many ways. When regulations are not followed in the whole entity of a city, where everything works by, we have adjacencies because there are some agreements that we have with each other. So when those are broken, then it makes city living quite unpleasant.
I've been involved with RIWABI, that's the Residents Welfare Association of Bangalore East, since 2013. And that was the time when I brought up, along with the rest of the committee, this issue of building bylaw violations in our area. So I live in what's called Ward 59 of the BBMP, which is called Maruti Sevanagar Ward. So I would actually pinpoint right to the time when Mr. K.J. George was elected in 2013, and he became Minister for Bangalore Development. He's our MLA for this area. So for this ward and some 7-8 other wards, he's the MLA. And he being the Minister for Bangalore Development, I would have expected he should have taken extra care of this ward. Whereas what we saw happening was that under the corporators of this ward, this is an old part of Bangalore, Cooktown and other parts. And a lot of individual bungalows were there, but one by one, the individual bungalows were demolished and apartments would come up. Now, given the road infrastructure and all that, where there's one house and you multiply it by 4 by having, let's say, multiple floors, it adds to traffic congestion and many things. Okay, we can't avoid having flats, but at least the flats can be built according to the bylaws of the BBMP, which places limitations on how many floors you have on a given square feet of site, how much setback you send, that is the space between the building and the road in front, between a building and the buildings on its sides, between a building and behind. There are rules to all of this. So at least if that could be observed, it would have been acceptable. But that's not what was happening since that time. So 2013 election is when he became MLA, Mr. George. And roughly from that time, we have seen what was a beautiful residential area gradually becoming a place of what we call illegal construction, in the sense not built the way the laws permit them. And the easiest way to look around this, if building typical site in Bangalore, I'm not saying each and every one, but by and large, let's say the 30, 40 kind of sites and above that. Ground plus 3 floors and minimum 1 meter setback on all sides is roughly what I would say. So if you see a building with ground plus 4 floors, which is quite common now, you can be sure that it's a violation. It's as simple as that. Unless they've left, let's say, enough space around for a fire engine to go and things like that, which is a 15 feet setback. So that's what we've been seeing. Extra floors all around, space not being left between the sides of buildings. And that leads to all kinds of problems. The recent collapses, I think almost all of them had an extra floor, except one government building, which was on the KMF property. That I think was just an old building, which should not have collapsed, but that was a government construction. But the private constructions, as far as I could make out, all had extra floors. So if they want to talk about weak soil and all that, I mean, I saw the BBMP commissioner was trying to say the soil testing was not done and all that. But as soon as you have an extra floor, the BBMP cannot blame the soil. They have to blame themselves because they should have prevented the extra flow coming up. That's the job of the BBMP.
Right.
But the elected representatives, and I spoke about my MLA, it suits them, the MLAs, the corporators all across Bangalore, it suits them to allow the engineers to take bribes, which in turn funds the entire political system. So this is a huge source of income for the political parties. So I'm not accusing anyone specific. I'm saying there is a problem. I could see a problem coinciding with the beginning of our MLA's term as Bangalore Development Minister, which gives him a lot of power over what happens in Bangalore, including introducing white topping and all kinds of things. So this is what I've seen since that time in 2013 that I've been involved, which happens to be the time of the new assembly being elected back then. And very specifically, I would like to say on the 10th of July 2019, a building collapsed in our area. It had, as usual in these constructions over the last few years, an extra floor. Probably it was poorly constructed, but so the lowest pillars collapsed. So the building as a block kind of came down and tilted. It hit the building next to it, affecting that building, which also had to be demolished because of this. And a few people died in this incident. And some of us have, I mean, that case, the police tried to hush it up. A few of us went to court to get the charge sheet filed. So maybe a couple of months ago is when finally the police were forced to file a charge sheet, which has the builders, the contractors, and the BBMP officials in it. We have to see which way that case will go.
It needs to be given a serious relook from the authorities, because I think that's where a lot of the control regulations begin and end. And so I think it would be best if there were, let's just say, an urban construction think tank, for instance, where government and especially those departments concerned with building and regulations are able to work with architects, landscape architects, have think tanks in their local wards or whatever, who are able to help put in place certain, sort of block the leaks right now, block the leaks in the system, which is that someone can build a 9-story house and have no regulations, have no sanction plan, have no fire clearances, who knows what the footings are, So I think those leaks need to be plugged, that everyone needs to be responsible to everyone else, because we're living in a city, and we have certain commitments to each other. So I think that's the first thing. It needs a consolidation of the public realm and the private realm coming together as local think tank bodies with expertise embedded within those structures. So that, and then from there, I think there need to be sort of ways, and this would really happen by collaborative discussions, meaningful discussions, which are really to plug the loopholes in the system, because the system exists, but it's not being implemented. There are fire regulations, but no one's following it, and there's no checking happening. And in our own case, we had next to my mother's house, we had a huge, maybe a 7-story building built with literally no bylaws, but we had no recourse to anyone who could say, this is what you can do, and you can file a complaint and we look into it. That doesn't happen. The mechanism fails. And what is expected then is that the private citizen, who's working in his own capacity, is required then to file a stay order, to go to the court, which to me seems very unfair. In a good, healthy city, it should be that we can go to our local elected authorities and say, hey, this is my problem. Can you look into it? And that recourse is not there right now. So there's a leak in the system and it has to be plugged. So it's going to take the citizenry to get involved with the government and then together build a system that is quite robust. And it's possible, but someone needs to initiate it.
All doesn't seem hopeless here. For years, members of resident welfare associations and citizens have routinely approached senior bureaucrats, the court, as well as Lokayukta. In September, following the collapse of 2 buildings, Gaurav Gupta, the Chief Commissioner of BBMP, said that he was reconducting a survey which will look at the dilapidated buildings in the city and action will be taken against violators. But is that enough? This is Vaishnavi Suresh and you're watching Mojo Stories.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.